The flicker of a torch dances across cold stone walls, echoing softly in corridors where shadows cling and secrets linger. Imagine the damp chill pressing against your skin, the faint scent of centuries-old decay, and the hushed whispers of those long forgotten. Tonight we'll wander quietly through the harsh, hidden realities of medieval dungeons, places where survival was a daily challenge, and even the smallest comforts were rare treasures. Along the way, you might notice curious details about these grim chambers that most history books overlook, and perhaps discover why a single day could feel like a lifetime. If you enjoy these gentle historical journeys, feel free to like, subscribe, or share your thoughts, though only if it feels cozy to do so. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? The dungeon was a place where light itself seemed to die. From the moment a prisoner was dragged down into its depths, the outside world disappeared forever. There were no windows, no cracks in the stone through which sunlight could pass, no reminder that above the ground there still existed day and night. In the pitch-black corridors, time lost its meaning. A man could spend hours or weeks or even years chained to the wall, never truly knowing how many days had slipped by. The only rhythm that marked his life was the occasional creak of a guard's footsteps, or the sound of a metal door opening and closing. The absence of windows was not a mistake of design, it was deliberate cruelty. Medieval dungeons were built as tombs for the living, meant to crush both body and soul. A shaft of sunlight, even the smallest glimpse of the outside world, could have given hope, and hope was dangerous. Hope could keep a prisoner strong enough to resist, strong enough to dream of freedom. But here, in this stone coffin, there was nothing. Only suffocating blackness, broken now and then by the faint glow of a torch carried by a guard. A torch that vanished again, leaving the prisoner blind once more. In such darkness, the mind began to betray itself. At first, a man tried to count the hours by the sound of his own breathing, by the beating of his heart. But after days without sunlight, his senses slipped. Was it morning? Was it night? He could not tell. He closed his eyes and saw nothing. He opened them and still saw nothing. The difference between waking and dreaming blurred until both felt the same. Some prisoners whispered that the dungeon swallowed time itself, that once you entered, the world outside moved on without you, leaving you trapped in a place where the sun would never rise again. The stone walls were always damp, sweating with cold moisture that dripped onto the floor. The air smelled of wet earth and mould. With no sunlight to dry them, the walls became a breeding ground for decay. Prisoners sat in this darkness, their backs pressed against slick stone, listening to the water drip, endlessly, like the ticking of a clock that marked not hours but suffering. For those who had once lived under the open sky, the absence of light was the cruelest punishment. Farmers who had worked the fields, soldiers who had marched beneath the sun, even beggars who had begged in the marketplace, all found themselves here, robbed of the one thing they had always taken for granted, the simple sight of day. The memory of sunlight became a torment in itself. They would close their eyes and try to recall its warmth, the golden glow on their skin, the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. But memory was fragile. Over time, even the image of the sun began to fade. What once had been a clear picture became a vague blur, until the prisoner could no longer remember what daylight truly looked like. Some broke quickly. They screamed for the guards to bring them outside, begged for even a moment of sunlight before they died. Others became silent, withdrawing deep into their minds, clinging to fragments of light they carried only in memory. But no matter how strong a man thought he was, the endless dark wore him down. The dungeon did not need whips or chains to torture him. Its greatest weapon was the simple, crushing absence of windows and sunlight. And in that crushing darkness, something worse always lurked. For where there is no light, there is no safety. A prisoner's eyes would strain, trying to pierce the blackness. But there was always the sense of something moving. A rat, a spider, or perhaps something far more terrifying. The darkness was never empty. It was in this suffocating void, without the comfort of light, that the true nightmare of the medieval dungeon began. The darkness was bad enough, but the dungeon did not stop there. It had its own way of reminding every prisoner that they were buried alive. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with the misery of the place. Made of thick stone, they were never dry. Day after day, cold water seeped through the cracks, running down in thin streams or dripping steadily from above. The sound of droplets striking the floor echoed endlessly, a hollow rhythm that filled the silence when the screams of others had faded. For a man trapped inside, the drip became a curse, too faint to distract, too constant to ignore. It drilled into the mind a reminder that escape was impossible, and that the very walls around him were alive with decay. The dampness made the dungeon colder than any winter night. Without sunlight or fire, the chill soaked into the bones of every prisoner. Clothes rotted on their backs, sticking to the skin as they absorbed the moisture of the walls. Blankets, if given at all, became heavy with dampness, more like icy shackles than sources of warmth. Men shivered until their teeth rattled, their bodies convulsing as though the walls themselves were trying to shake the life out of them. The dripping water carried more than cold, it carried sickness. Mould grew thick on the stones, releasing a musty stench that filled every breath. Prisoners coughed in the darkness, hacking and choking as spores filled their lungs. Some developed fevers, shivering violently before growing weak and silent. The damp air was poison, but there was no escape. No window to open, no sunlight to dry the walls, no fresh breeze to bring relief. Every breath was borrowed from death itself. At times, prisoners would lick the damp stone out of desperation, hoping to quench their thirst. The guards provided little water, sometimes none at all, and the dripping seemed like a cruel temptation. But the liquid was tainted, carrying the filth of rot and mould. Those who drank it grew sick, their stomachs twisting with pain. Yet thirst was merciless. More than one prisoner pressed his lips to the wall, knowing it could kill him, but too desperate to resist. The walls also played tricks on the mind. In the endless dark, the faint gleam of wet stone looked like movement. A prisoner might imagine faces forming in the damp patches, cruel eyes staring back at him, or mouths opening wide to whisper secrets only he could hear. The longer he stared, the more the shape seemed alive until he no longer knew what was real and what was born of madness. Some clawed at the stones, scraping their fingers bloody as they tried to peel away the wet layers, convinced something was hidden beneath. Others pressed their ears to the wall, swearing they heard voices in the dripping, voices of those who had died before, calling them deeper into despair. But the true horror was not the water itself, it was what the dampness invited. In the cracks of the wet walls, creatures thrived. Slugs and worms slid across the stones, snails crawled blindly, and spiders spun webs in the dripping corners. At night, rats emerged from holes, their claws scratching the stone as they searched for food. They lapped at the same water the prisoners had licked, their whiskers brushing against trembling hands. In the dark, no man could tell whether the wetness on his face was sweat, a tear, or the touch of something crawling across his skin. The dungeon was alive because of its dampness, alive with decay, alive with vermin, alive with the slow erosion of the human spirit. The prisoners had no choice but to endure it. Day after day, the walls dripped and dripped as though mocking them, as though counting the endless hours of their torment. And in that damp chill, with the walls pressing close, and the air thick with mould, breathing itself became a battle. For in the dungeon, even the air was not meant for survival. The dampness of the walls was only the beginning, for the dungeon's air itself turned against those trapped within. It was thick, heavy, and stale, as though the space had not known freshness since the day it was built. With no windows to let in even the faintest breeze, the air hung motionless, suffocating, filling the lungs like a slow, invisible weight. Breathing became labour, not life. Each inhale was shallow, strained, and unsatisfying, as though the dungeon begrudged even the gift of oxygen. The foulness of the air came from the mixture of everything festering in the dark. Rotting straw, soaked in filth, released a stench that clung to the back of the throat. Mould climbed the dripping walls, its spores drifting into every corner, coating the lungs of those who dared to breathe. And then there was the smell of human misery, the stench of sweat, of sickness, of wounds that festered without treatment. For some, the air was unendurable from the first moment. For others, it slowly worked its poison, until breathing felt like swallowing ash. Prisoners often coughed until their chests burned, hacking into the void, the sound bouncing back at them as though the dungeon itself laughed at their suffering. Some spat blood, their lungs shredded by the invisible filth in the air. Others grew weak and dizzy, starved of oxygen, collapsing into the damp straw and never rising again. The dungeon did not need ropes or blades to kill. It could choke a man to death with nothing more than the foul breath of its own walls. For those who survived longer, the air turned every moment into torment. They could never escape it, never take a single clean breath. Some tried to cover their mouths with scraps of cloth or torn sleeves, hoping to filter out the rot, but it made little difference. The stench seeped through everything. Men gagged on it, their stomachs twisting, though they had little left to vomit. Hunger hollowed them, but the air sickened them, leaving them too weak to resist despair. The psychological torture was just as cruel as the physical. In the heavy air, time itself seemed to stand still. Prisoners grew lightheaded, their minds clouded by lack of fresh breath. Nightmares came not only in sleep but while awake, visions born from oxygen-starved brains. A man might swear he saw the sun for a fleeting second, or heard the sound of a river flowing nearby. But these were only tricks, cruel illusions of a mind suffocating in stale air. And when reality snapped back, he was left gasping in the dark, choking on despair. The air also carried the voices of others. In the stillness, every cough, every cry, every rattling breath of the dying echoed from one cell to another. The sound was impossible to ignore. It crept into the ears of those still clinging to life, reminding them that soon they too would choke their last. And when one prisoner's final gasp finally fell silent, the silence was worse. The dungeon seemed to swallow the sound of death, feeding it into the air, making the survivors breathe it in as though the very essence of the dead became part of the poison filling their lungs. Some guards delighted in this invisible torture. They did not always raise the whip or strike with the sword. They did not need to. They could simply close the heavy doors, seal the dungeon tighter, and let the air do their work for them. To them, suffocation was slower than a blade, but far more entertaining. The worst of all was the knowledge that the heavy air was endless. A man could close his eyes against the darkness, cover his ears against the screams, even turn away from the dripping walls, but he could never stop breathing. To live, he had to draw the dungeon into himself with every gasp. Every breath was betrayal, feeding the prison's poison deeper into his body, and yet, despite the choking air, despite the rot and the stench, the dungeon still held one more horror. Because what thrived in this foulness was not just despair, but life of another kind. Life that scuttled, squeaked, and sank its teeth into the helpless, waiting for the moment when the prisoners were too weak to resist. As if the darkness, the damp, and the suffocating air were not enough, the dungeon had one final method to strip a prisoner of his humanity: chains. No one was left free inside those walls. Every man was bound hand and foot, his body reduced to little more than a helpless weight pressed against the stone. The iron shackles were not simply tools of restraint. They were instruments of slow torture, designed to remind the captive that even his own limbs no longer belonged to him. The chains were heavy, often weighing more than the strength of a starving man could bear. Cold iron cut into the wrists, leaving deep grooves that never healed. Around the ankles the cuffs rubbed raw until skin peeled away, exposing bleeding flesh. Infection followed quickly. Pus oozed from wounds, attracting flies that feasted in the darkness, their buzzing another cruel reminder of decay. And yet, no matter how badly the flesh rotted, the iron never loosened. The shackles remained gnawing at the bone until pain became a constant companion. The bindings allowed only the smallest of movements. A prisoner could not stand fully upright, nor lie down with comfort. He was forced into a half-sitting, half-kneeling position that twisted the spine and cramped the legs. Hours turned to days, days to weeks, until his muscles wasted away from disuse. Cramps seized his body without mercy, but there was no stretching, no shifting, no relief. The chains reminded him with every twitch that freedom was an illusion. Some were nailed to the very walls, iron collars locked around their necks, holding their heads stiff and still. Others were fastened to the floor, forced to lie in the filth of their own straw bedding, unable to rise. Rats and vermin crawled over them at will, and the bound man could do nothing to swat them away. Even the simple act of scratching an itch became impossible. To be chained was not only to be imprisoned, but to be stripped of every small dignity, until a man felt less like a human, and more like a carcass waiting to rot. The guards took delight in these restraints. They knew the chains did their work without lash or blade. They would rattle the shackles as they passed, laughing as prisoners flinched at the sound. Sometimes they tightened the cuffs just to watch the agony flare across hollow faces. At other times they left them deliberately loose, so the iron scraped and banged with every small movement, reminding the captive of his own helplessness. But the true cruelty of being bound was not only in the pain, it was in the helplessness. A man chained could not protect himself. He could not fight when rats bit at his toes or spiders crawled across his face. He could not help his fellow prisoner, even when the man beside him coughed his last and slumped into silence. He could not even raise his hands to wipe his own tears. All he could do was sit, wait, and feel his body rot around him. The dungeon had a way of turning restraint into despair. Shackled in the dark, bound in dampness, gasping for air, the prisoners began to forget what freedom felt like. They no longer dreamed of walking under the sun or running across fields. They dreamed only of moving their arms, of stretching their legs, of feeling the weight of their own body free from chains. Freedom itself became so small, so pitiful, that it shrank to the size of a single step. But even that single step was impossible here. And so, bound hand and foot, the prisoners remained, broken not just in body but in spirit. For the dungeon did not need swords to conquer men. It needed only chains. Yet chains were not the dungeon's only cruelty. Beyond restraint lay a fate even worse. The deliberate instruments of torment. The devices built not simply to hold a prisoner, but to tear him apart piece by piece. The chains were not simply iron on flesh. They were cages for the body itself. To be shackled hand and foot meant more than just being restrained. It meant living without freedom of movement, as though one's very body had been stolen away. The dungeon was a place where the simplest of human gestures, stretching an arm, shifting a leg, even turning onto one side, became impossible luxuries. A prisoner might imagine himself raising his hands to cover his face, or reaching out to touch the wall, but imagination was all he had left. Reality bound him tighter than any dream could break. Days of stillness slowly twisted the body into ruin. Muscles that once carried ploughs, swung swords, or built stone houses wasted away into nothing. The shoulders stiffened, the legs cramped, the back arched painfully as it was forced against damp stone. A man who had marched for miles under the open sky could now barely shuffle a few inches in his chains. His body was trapped in a position chosen not by himself, but by his captors, a cruel parody of life, where existence was measured in the smallest twitches of fingers and toes. The lack of movement poisoned more than the flesh. Blood pooled in the legs, swelling them until the skin stretched tight, purple and sore. Joints locked up until every attempt at motion felt like fire spreading through the limbs. Men screamed not because of the guards' whips, but because their own bodies betrayed them. To sit for hours on end was painful. To sit for days was torture. To sit for weeks was death drawn out one breath at a time. And the stillness was not peaceful. It was maddening. In the dark, with no freedom to shift or pace, the mind turned inward. Thoughts chased themselves in circles, growing darker with every passing hour. A prisoner might dream of standing, of taking a single step, of raising his hand toward the light that no longer existed. But when he opened his eyes, the reality of immobility crushed him again, and the dream became just another torment. Worse still, the lack of movement left prisoners completely vulnerable. When the vermin came, rats scurrying across the floor, biting at toes and fingers, there was no way to fight them off. When a spider crawled across the face, there was no swatting it away. Even when filth from the ceiling dripped onto the skin, the man could not brush it aside. He was a living statue, left to endure every crawling creature, every drop of dampness, every stab of pain in silence. Some prisoners tried to resist the stillness by rocking in their chains, swaying back and forth like broken pendulums. It gave them no relief, only louder clanking of iron and deeper wounds on their wrists and ankles. Others banged their heads against the wall, desperate for sensation, desperate for any proof that their bodies still belonged to them. But even these small rebellions ended quickly. leaving only exhaustion and despair. The guards knew the value of stillness as punishment. They did not always beat or starve their prisoners, sometimes they only tightened the chains and walked away. They knew that motion itself was life, and by stealing it they robbed a man of his very humanity. To keep a man still was to make him less than human, less than animal, a thing, a husk, a forgotten shadow rotting in the dark. And so the prisoners sat, bound and immobile, their bodies slowly collapsing under their own weight. In a world without freedom of movement, even the thought of lifting a hand or taking a step became a dream worth dying for. Yet this immobility was not the dungeon's worst cruelty. For beyond the chains and the stillness lay horrors crafted with deliberate malice, torture devices, built not only to hold the body, but to shatter the soul. In the dungeon, even sleep offered no escape. The body, exhausted from hunger, darkness, and suffocation, longed for rest. Yet the shackles made certain that rest was nothing more than another form of pain. When a prisoner's eyes finally closed, the weight of the iron did not lessen. It pressed harder. Around the ankles, the cuffs dug deeper into flesh as the man's body sagged sideways onto the damp straw. Around the wrists, the chains tightened as arms twisted awkwardly in unconscious motion. Every shift in sleep became a punishment, every small dream interrupted by the sudden stab of metal against skin. There was no position of comfort. Some prisoners tried to curl onto their sides, but the shackles twisted their joints, forcing the body into unnatural angles. Others slumped forward, their heads hanging heavy, only to be yanked awake when the iron collar or wrist chains cut into their throats. Lying flat was nearly impossible, as the cuffs and bolts that tethered them to the wall dragged them back upright, leaving them suspended between rest and torture. In this way, sleep itself turned into a battlefield, where the prisoner fought not nightmares, but the iron biting into his flesh. The sound of sleep was just as cruel. At night, when the dungeon fell into deeper silence, the only noises were the groans of men twisting in their chains, the clatter of shackles scraping the stone, and the faint cries that broke from lips even while dreaming. Many woke to their own screams, startled by the pain that had followed them into unconsciousness. Others never fully slept at all, drifting in and out of shallow dozes, trapped between waking misery and restless torment. The shackles also ensured that healing was impossible. Small wounds caused by rubbing iron became gaping sores, reopened each night as the prisoner shifted in uneasy sleep. Blood stained the damp straw, and pus oozed down the ankles and wrists. Infection took hold quickly, its heat burning through fevered skin. Yet there was no relief. Not even unconsciousness spared them from the agony. The body was forced to feel every moment of suffering, whether awake or asleep. Some prisoners whispered of dreams where they were free, walking under the open sky, stretching their arms, even running across fields of grass. But the cruelest part was waking. For when their eyes opened, the dream dissolved instantly, and the chains reminded them with fresh pain that freedom was only a fantasy. The contrast between dream and reality became torture in itself, sharper than any blade. Guards often laughed when men woke weeping, mocking them for crying over the sunlight they would never see again. The endless cycle of sleeplessness broke the mind as surely as it broke the body. With no real rest, men grew delirious. They spoke to shadows, muttered to the walls, or cried out for mothers, wives, or children who would never come. Some refused to close their eyes altogether, fearing the pain that sleep would bring. Yet exhaustion always won, dragging them back into a restless haze where shackles cut, pressed, and burned their flesh anew. In time, prisoners forgot what it felt like to truly rest. Sleep became nothing more than another form of waking agony, another link in the chain of their suffering. Their hollow eyes and trembling bodies showed the truth. In the dungeon, even dreams had been stolen, and this was no accident. The medieval dungeon was crafted not only to punish by day, but to torment by night. There was no moment of relief, no sanctuary in darkness, no kindness in sleep. The shackles pressed always, turning every breath, every heartbeat, every second of rest into another reminder that the prisoner was not free. But the shackles were only the beginning of engineered suffering. For beyond the iron, the dungeon held devices of true horror. Creations built to twist, tear, and break the human spirit until nothing remained but a whisper of pain. If the shackles made rest impossible, the filth of the dungeon made life itself unbearable. Among the cruelties of that place, none was more degrading than the absence of proper toilet facilities. The prisoners were left to relieve themselves where they sat, chained to the wall, unable to move or seek privacy. Straw beneath them soaked with urine and waste, rotting quickly in the damp air until it became a festering bed of disease. The stink of it rose constantly, a choking cloud that mixed with the mould and decay already filling the dungeon. There were no buckets that were regularly emptied, no channels to carry the filth away. If a bucket was provided at all, it was rarely cleared, often spilling over until its contents spread across the floor. Men too weak to lift themselves or too tightly bound to reach it had no choice but to soil themselves. Their skin blistered with rashes, their sores grew infected, and their dignity was stripped away one humiliation at a time. The dungeon was not merely a prison, it was a sewer where men were left to rot in their own waste. The smell was overwhelming. Even those who had grown used to the damp, the rats and the darkness could never grow numb to the stench of human excrement that clung to the air. It filled every breath, turning the act of inhaling into another torment. Prisoners gagged, vomited, and coughed until their throats burned, yet the smell never lessened. The heavy air carried it from one cell to another, so that even those who still tried to keep some sense of decency were forced to breathe in the filth of others. But the humiliation went deeper than the stench. To relieve oneself in front of others, bound and helpless, stripped the prisoners of every shred of dignity. There was no privacy, no curtain, no space to turn away. A man's shame became another prisoner's torment, and soon shame itself was eaten away. They became like animals, forced into filth, stripped of choice, and once dignity was lost, despair quickly followed. The waste also bred vermin. Flies swarmed constantly, landing on wounds, crawling into mouths and eyes. Worms wriggled in the straw, feeding on the rot. Rats gathered where the filth was thickest, gnawing not only on scraps, but sometimes on the flesh of men too weak to swat them away. In the dark, a prisoner never knew whether the tickle on his skin was sweat, filth, or a rat's whiskers as it searched for food. The dungeon blurred all lines between man and beast, until the prisoners became part of the same crawling decay. Disease spread quickly in this filth. Dysentery, fevers, and infections raged through the cells, killing men faster than the guard's whips or the executioner's blade. Once illness took hold, there was no cure, no medicine, no clean water to wash away the sickness. The filth was a weapon, slow but unstoppable, claiming life after life as the guards watched with indifference. For the dungeon itself was designed to be executioner, killing with waste and shame where the sword did not need to fall. Even the act of dying offered no escape. When a prisoner perished in his own filth, the body was left for days, sometimes weeks, slumped in straw, already thick with waste. The living were forced to sit beside the dead, breathing the same air, surrounded by the same stink, until death claimed them as well. In this way, the dungeon consumed its victims not in sudden cruelty, but in a slow, grinding humiliation that stripped away both body and soul. There was no relief from it, not in sleep, not in silence, not even in death. The filth clung to everything, seeping into skin, hair, and lungs, a reminder that the dungeon was not simply a prison, but a place where human beings were deliberately reduced to less than animals. And still, the cruelty was not complete, for the filth and stench prepared the body for further torment, softening it, weakening it, until the prisoner was ready to face the true horrors waiting deeper in the dark, those instruments of pain crafted by human hands, built for one purpose only, to break the spirit beyond repair. The filth of the dungeon was not just an insult to dignity, it was a poison that slowly invaded every body trapped within. From the rotting straw soaked in urine and feces to the stagnant pools of water dripping from the ceiling, every corner of the dungeon was alive with sickness. And in that suffocating darkness, diseases spread not only through touch or contaminated food, but through the very air itself. The foul smells became carriers of death. Each breath was a gamble, a risk of inhaling the invisible seeds of illness that swirled in the heavy air. The prisoners lived surrounded by rot, waste mixed with dampness, creating a breeding ground for plague. Rats thrived in it, their bodies crawling with fleas which leapt from rodent to man, carrying sickness with them. The foul odours rising from the straw were not just unpleasant, they were toxic, filled with particles of decay. Men coughed and wheezed, their lungs filling with infection until they spat blood into the same filth they were forced to sit in. At first the sickness came quietly, a headache, a burning throat, a cough that refused to fade. But soon it grew violent. Skin broke out in boils, oozing pus that spread to others through the smallest touch. Fevers burned so high that men trembled and shook, their teeth rattling against the iron of their shackles. Dysentery swept through the dungeon, leaving prisoners weak and dehydrated, unable to move from where they sat, chained in their own waste. Some grew delirious, muttering nonsense before collapsing into unconsciousness. The guards did nothing. They rarely entered the cells, not for fear of compassion, but for fear of the stench. From the safety of the corridor they tossed in scraps of mouldy bread or a bucket of foul water, never bothering to see which prisoners were alive and which had already succumbed. Disease was the dungeon's silent executioner, doing the work of the torturer without a whip or blade. The worst part was the inescapability of it. A healthy prisoner could be placed beside a sick one, and within days the disease would spread. There was no space, no distance, no clean air to separate the living from the dying. When one man coughed, the sound echoed across the chamber, carrying with it the stench of his sickness, and as each breath of foul air was drawn into another set of lungs, the infection multiplied. It was as though the dungeon itself was breathing death upon its captives. Many prisoners understood what was happening but were powerless to stop it. They begged to be moved, pleaded for fresh air, even prayed for the mercy of a quicker death. Some tried to cover their faces with scraps of cloth or straw, but nothing kept out the invisible poison. In time, they realized the truth. The very act of breathing was killing them. The diseases didn't just destroy the body, they stripped away hope. To see a man who once spoke, begged and wept slowly reduced to a shivering skeleton, coughing blood was to glimpse one's own future. The dungeon became a gallery of decay, every prisoner a reflection of the slow death waiting for the rest. The living sat beside corpses, listening to the wheezing breaths fade into silence, knowing their own would follow soon. Outside the dungeon walls, the world believed these men were being punished, but inside, punishment was too small a word. The dungeon was not a place for justice. It was a breeding pit of plague, designed to let disease finish what iron and shackles began. In the end, few men left alive, and those who did carried the sickness with them, weak, broken, and forever haunted by the memory of breathing air so foul it could kill. And yet, as unbearable as the sickness was, it was not the final cruelty. For those who clung to life through the rot, the filth, and the fever, worse torments awaited. The deliberate instruments of pain, sharpened and waiting in the shadows, built to crush not only flesh, but the very spirit of man. If disease was the dungeon's silent assassin, then the very air itself was its constant accomplice. Inside those stone walls, the air was not just heavy with stench, it was poisoned. Every breath carried a mixture of rot, decay, and death, slowly breaking down the lungs of anyone trapped within. To inhale was to swallow sickness, to fill the chest with a bitterness that never left. Prisoners often said the air felt thicker than water, clinging to the throat, choking them with every gasp. The pollution came from everywhere. Waste left to rot on the ground, the bodies of those who had already perished, the damp straw fermenting beneath the prisoners' weight. All of it released gases that thickened the air into a toxic fog. The flickering torches the guards carried added smoke, filling the dungeon with fumes that stung the eyes and made breathing even harder. There was no movement of wind, no circulation, no window to release the poison. The dungeon was a sealed tomb, where each prisoner slowly suffocated on the air he was forced to share with the dying and the dead. The effects of this poisoned atmosphere were swift. Men who had entered with strong lungs soon wheezed like old men. Their coughs rattled through the darkness, hacking up blackened phlegm that splattered onto the damp stone. Some felt a constant pressure in their chests, as though invisible hands were pressing against their ribs, never letting them fully breathe. Others suffered dizziness, fainting suddenly as their lungs failed to pull enough air into their bodies. The air didn't just choke them, it poisoned their minds. With every hour spent breathing the same stagnant fumes, confusion grew. Prisoners reported seeing shadows that weren't there, hearing voices whispering through the walls. The lack of oxygen clouded their thoughts, making them forget their names, their families, even the reason they were imprisoned. Slowly the dungeon stripped them not only of strength but of identity. The smell of death made the air worse still. Corpses left to rot released their own poison. Gases bubbled from swollen bodies, spreading sickness with every whiff. The living were forced to breathe in the decay of the dead, their stomachs twisting with nausea until they vomited onto the floor, only to add to the pollution themselves. The air became a cycle of death. Waste feeding disease, disease feeding death, and death feeding the poisoned air. Guards rarely lingered long inside the cells, for even they could not stand the foulness. They covered their noses with cloth soaked in vinegar, stepping back quickly after throwing in food or dragging out a corpse. But the prisoners had no escape. They were chained, helpless, forced to sit in an atmosphere that killed more surely than any sword. Unlike wounds or shackles, poisoned air could not be resisted. It slipped inside with every breath, invisible and unstoppable, slowly eating away at life. Some prisoners tried to hold their breath in desperation, but their bodies betrayed them. No one could fight the need to breathe. Each gasp was a surrender, each lungful of foul air a reminder that survival itself had become a punishment. The dungeon turned the most natural act, breathing, into a torment, and so men died not in sudden violence, but in suffocating silence. Their final moments were spent gasping, eyes wide, mouths open, struggling to pull in one last breath of poisoned air. Their bodies collapsed into the same rot that had killed them, feeding the dungeon's endless cycle of pollution. The dungeon was no mere prison. It was a machine of decay. Its very air was an executioner, ensuring that even those who escaped the whip, the chain, or the fever could not escape death. For here, even the act of breathing, the essence of life itself, was twisted into an instrument of suffering. But the air was only part of the dungeon's cruelty. Beyond the suffocation, beyond the poison, worse awaited in the shadows, deliberate instruments of torment, crafted not by nature but by human hands, designed to shatter body and spirit alike. As if the foul, poisoned air were not enough, the dungeon bred something far worse, an unending cycle of plague, fever, and deadly illnesses that tore through the prisoners like wildfire. In such filth, sickness was not an accident. It was inevitable. The dungeon was built not only to confine, but to kill slowly, and disease became its most loyal weapon. The plague often came first, carried in on the backs of rats that scurried freely through the straw and over the prisoners' shackled feet. Their fleas leapt from fur to skin, biting deep and carrying with them invisible death. Soon, the first signs appeared, swollen lumps under the arms and along the neck, hot to the touch and bursting with pus. The prisoner who bore these marks seldom lasted long. Fever consumed him, delirium set in, and within days he collapsed into the straw, his body twitching violently before falling still. But the plague was not the only enemy. Fevers raged constantly in the dungeon, often born of infection from shackles digging into raw skin or wounds never cleaned. A simple cut could swell into a festering mass, red and hot, spreading poison through the blood until the entire body burned. The prisoners shook with chills one moment and sweated uncontrollably the next, their bodies trembling against the damp stone as though caught between fire and ice. The fever robbed them of reason, leaving them mumbling nonsense, shouting at shadows, or begging for water that never came. Deadly illnesses grew like weeds in that poisoned place. Dysentery swept through the prisoners, leaving them weak, dehydrated, and too feeble to even lift their heads. Consumption, the slow, wasting disease, hollowed out men from within, their coughing fits spattering blood across the straw. Some prisoners clutched their stomachs in agony as unseen parasites gnawed at their insides, contracted from contaminated water and rotting food. Each disease seemed to make way for another, until a single man often bore 3 or 4 torments in his body at once. The dungeon offered no care, no comfort, no escape. A sick prisoner was left to rot in his chains beside the healthy, ensuring that his suffering spread like fire. The moans of the ill filled the darkness, mingling with the sound of coughing, retching, and the clatter of shackles against stone as fevered men thrashed in delirium. At night the groans grew louder, more desperate, until one by one they fell silent, replaced by the stillness of death. The living watched their cellmates die and knew their own turn was coming. Each fevered scream was a mirror of their future. Some prayed for a quick end, others fought desperately, clawing at the chains, gasping for air, begging the guards for mercy. But no mercy came. To the keepers of the dungeon, disease was a blessing. It spared them the labour of execution. The smell of illness filled the chamber, a sour, choking odour that clung to the skin and hair of the survivors. Corpses were not always removed. Quickly, and their rotting bodies swelled and burst, releasing more sickness into the air. The dungeon became a graveyard long before the prisoners were truly dead, its stones soaked with the blood, vomit, and pus of countless souls. What made the suffering worse was its slowness. Swords and gallows killed in moments, but plague and fever devoured life over days and weeks. A prisoner might linger, half dead, for so long that others forgot what he looked like when he was still human. By the time death finally came, it felt less like an ending and more like a release from an endless torment. The dungeon thrived on these illnesses. They were not accidents of poor conditions, but tools of control, stripping away hope, breaking down strength, and turning men into hollow shells before death finally claimed them. The dungeon was not just a cage, it was a breeding ground of death, where the plague and fever became as certain as the chains themselves. And for those who survived the sickness, what awaited them was worse still, the deliberate agony of torture devices, waiting silently in the shadows, crafted to destroy not the body alone, but the very will to live. By the time plague and fever had taken their toll, the body of nearly every prisoner was marked by wounds, and in the dungeon, wounds were never allowed to heal. The iron shackles rubbed constantly against skin, tearing it raw. Chains cut into wrists and ankles, and the damp, filthy air prevented even the smallest scratch from closing. Every injury, no matter how minor, turned into a festering sore. Infection was not just common, it was inevitable. The straw on which the prisoners sat was soaked with urine, blood, and filth. When torn skin pressed against it, the wound absorbed the rot of the dungeon itself. Soon redness spread across the flesh, swelling and throbbing with heat. Pus oozed from gashes, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay. Men shivered with fever as infection crept deeper, turning scratches into abscesses and bruises into rotting flesh. The pain of these wounds was constant and unbearable. Shackles rubbed the same sores day after day, grinding into swollen tissue until bone threatened to show through. Prisoners winced at every movement, but there was no position of relief. Even sleep could not free them. The iron pressed tighter, reopening cuts again and again. Flies swarmed around the sores, laying eggs inside them, so that maggots crawled across the flesh of the living. Some prisoners clawed at their own skin in desperation, trying to dig out the creatures eating them alive. Without treatment, the infection spread swiftly through the body. Limbs swelled grotesquely, skin stretched tight and purple, while veins darkened as poison travelled through the blood. Many men lost their strength entirely, unable to stand even if unchained, their bodies trembling from fever and weakness. Gangrene often followed, turning flesh black and foul, filling the dungeon with yet another layer of stench. In some cases, fingers or toes simply rotted away, dropping into the straw while the man who owned them screamed in agony. The dungeon provided no healing herbs, no clean water, no bandages. Even if a prisoner tried to cover his wounds with scraps of cloth, the fabric only absorbed more filth, pressing dirt and rot deeper into the infection. Guards mocked those who begged for relief, sometimes prodding the wounds with sticks or blades to watch the prisoners howl. To the jailers, a festering wound was entertainment, proof that the dungeon was doing its work. For the prisoners themselves, the suffering went beyond the physical. Watching one's own body decay while still alive shattered the mind. A man could feel death creeping inch by inch through his veins, yet he was powerless to stop it. Each day he grew weaker, his body betraying him, his flesh becoming alien. Hope faded as quickly as health, leaving only despair and the certainty that his body would rot entirely before it was released by death. Those who survived longer carried scars as cruel reminders. Their skin was pitted and twisted, their limbs crooked where infection had eaten through muscle. Some lost the use of their arms or legs, reduced to crawling through their chains like broken animals. And for these survivors, torment was not over, because the jailers had yet to unleash the most intentional, crafted pain of all, the dungeon's tools of torture. The festering wounds were only the dungeon's preparation, softening the flesh and breaking the spirit. By the time the torturer came, most prisoners were already half dead, their bodies weakened by infection, their will shattered by pain. The dungeon itself was a slow executioner, and the wounds it allowed to rot and fester were just one more step toward death. In that place, no one healed, no one recovered. Every cut was a sentence, every sore a promise. Infection was the dungeon's slow poison, ensuring that even those who endured chains, filth and disease would eventually fall to the rot eating them alive. And yet, this was still not the end. For when wounds and sickness had weakened the prisoner beyond resistance, the dungeon revealed its darkest secret. The deliberate instruments of torment, built by human hands to break body, mind, and soul. If wounds and sickness thrived in the dungeon, it was not only because of filth and chains, but because there was no medicine, no treatment, no relief of any kind. In the outside world, even the crudest healers could offer herbs, poultices, or a clean rag to wrap around a wound. But inside these walls, a prisoner's suffering was left to nature, and nature was merciless. The smallest injuries became death sentences. A scrape that might have healed in days outside turned into a festering sore when left untreated. Fever that might have been broken with herbs raged unchecked until the body burned itself out. A broken bone remained crooked, twisting a man's body, permanently because no one cared to set it straight. To the jailers, prisoners were not human beings worth saving. They were already condemned, and their slow decline was part of the punishment. Men begged for medicine, sometimes even offering what little they had left, rings, coins, or promises of service, just for a handful of herbs or a sip of clean water. Their pleas were met with laughter or cruelty. Guards mocked them, saying that treatment was wasted on those already destined for death. On rare occasions, prisoners were given something to stop the pain, but it was no cure, only crude and brutal. A bucket of cold water thrown over a fevered man, vinegar poured directly into an open wound, or even fire pressed against infected flesh. These treatments were nothing but new torments disguised as care. For the majority, the only doctors were time and agony. The sick relied on their bodies to fight off infection, but few had the strength. Hunger, cold, and chains weakened them long before illness set in. Some prisoners tried to treat each other with scraps of cloth or whispered advice remembered from home, but nothing could cleanse the poison of the dungeon. Instead, their desperate attempts often worsened the pain, spreading disease from one man to another. The absence of medicine was more than physical neglect. It was psychological cruelty. Knowing that no help would ever come broke the spirit faster than chains could. A man could endure pain if he believed it would pass, but in the dungeon there was no hope of healing. Each cough was a reminder that the lungs would only grow weaker. Each sore was a promise that the flesh would rot further. The prisoners lived with the certainty that their bodies were doomed to decay, piece by piece, without any chance of recovery. Some tried to pray for miracles, begging their gods to grant healing where men refused. Others whispered old folk remedies, imagining herbs that were not there, describing cures they would never touch. These fantasies were the only medicines they could cling to, hope in its weakest form. But even hope did not last long. When one prisoner after another died screaming from infection or fever, the others learned the cruel truth. Prayers and dreams could not survive in the dungeon. Even death from untreated illness was not quick. The body dragged itself through days of agony before finally surrendering. In that time, the lack of medicine turned suffering into a slow unravelling. Skin blackened, lungs filled, fevers consumed, and the prisoner endured it all while chained to stone, with no salve, No bandage, no relief. Death was not sudden. It was drawn out, a torment designed to remind every prisoner that healing would never come. And so the dungeon itself became a place of deliberate neglect, where pain was allowed to grow wild like weeds. Without medicine, without even the smallest act of compassion, every illness and wound became a weapon. The prisoners were not simply punished by what was done to them, but by what was denied them. But this cruelty was only preparation, for once the dungeon had weakened their bodies with untreated sickness and festering wounds, the true horrors awaited. Torture devices designed with precision and malice stood ready in the shadows, tools that needed no disease, no infection, to break the human spirit completely. If disease and festering wounds had not already stolen peace from the prisoners, the rats ensured there was no rest left at all. In the medieval dungeon, rats were not occasional visitors. They were permanent inhabitants, thriving in the filth, feeding on waste, corpses, and scraps of rotting food. The prisoners chained to their places could not escape them. Day and night, the vermin scurried across the damp floors, climbed the walls, and most horrifying of all, crawled directly over the straw that passed for the prisoners' beds. The straw itself was little more than a breeding ground for vermin. Soaked with urine and rotting with dampness, it gave warmth and shelter to nests of rats. When the prisoners lay chained upon it, they shared their bedding with the crawling creatures. At night, when the dungeon grew still, the scratching of claws and the squeaks of rats echoed louder than the groans of the sick. Prisoners would wake suddenly to the sharp nip of teeth at their feet or fingers, only to thrash helplessly against their chains as the rats darted across their bodies. The vermin were not content with crumbs alone. Hungry rats gnawed at sores and wounds, drawn by the smell of infection. Some prisoners awoke to find blood trickling down their skin where rats had bitten them in their sleep. Others, too weak to fight, simply lay still as the creatures feasted on their open flesh. More terrifying still, corpses left in the dungeon became food for the rats, who chewed at the dead until their faces and hands were unrecognisable. And if the dead were not removed quickly, the rats that had tasted corpses moved easily to the living, carrying death in their teeth. The humiliation was as cruel as the pain. A man already stripped of dignity by chains and filth was forced to endure the indignity of vermin crawling across his body, treating him as though he were part of the rot. Guards mocked this torment, sometimes tossing scraps of bread onto prisoners so that rats would swarm across them in a frenzy. To the jailers, it was entertainment. To the prisoners, it was another reminder that they were trapped in a place designed to erase their humanity. But rats were not only tormentors, they were carriers of death. Crawling through waste and corpses, they spread plague and disease wherever they went. Each scratch or bite risked infection. Each brush of their filthy fur brought new germs to open wounds. Fleas that lived on the rats leapt onto the prisoners, biting them and spreading the dreaded Black Death. In this way, the vermin turned the dungeon into both a living nightmare and a graveyard. Sleep, already impossible under shackles, became even more elusive under the threat of rats. Every rustle in the straw brought fear. Every squeak sent shivers down exhausted spines. Prisoners who managed to close their eyes were startled awake by the sensation of claws on their faces, whiskers against their skin, or sharp teeth breaking through flesh. In time, men grew paranoid, trembling at every sound, flinching at shadows, unable to tell if what they felt was real or imagined. The rats broke not only their bodies but their sanity. To the dungeon, the rats were part of the design. They kept the prisoners weak, diseased, and terrified, softening them for the greater cruelties yet to come. The rodents were the dungeon's allies, working alongside the chains, the filth, and the poisoned air to destroy every shred of resistance. And so, night after night, the prisoners lay trapped in their straw beds, unable to move, forced to share their last scraps of comfort with swarms of vermin. The dungeon had stolen sunlight, freedom, dignity, and health, and the rats stole what little sleep or safety remained. But even this ceaseless torment was not the worst fate waiting in those walls. For when the vermin, filth, and sickness had drained every last ounce of strength, the true horror was revealed. Torture devices waiting in the shadows, built with precision to break not only the flesh but the very spirit of man. If rats crawling across the prisoners' beds was not enough torment, The vermin ensured that survival itself was a daily struggle. The scraps of food tossed into the dungeon were pitiful to begin with. Hard crusts of stale bread, bowls of watery gruel, or bones stripped almost bare. Yet even these meagre rations were never safe. Long before a prisoner's chained hands could reach them, rats would swarm from every corner, snatching away crumbs and dragging them back into the darkness. Hunger was already gnawing at the captives, but the rats made starvation certain. A man might cradle his stale bread against his chest, desperate to shield it, only to feel sharp claws tearing at his clothes as vermin leapt to claim it. Others, too weak to fight, watched helplessly as entire meals were carried away piece by piece, stolen by the endless tide of squeaking shadows. What little strength the food might have given them was stripped away, leaving only emptiness and despair. Clothing, too, became a target for the ravenous creatures. The prisoners' rags were their only barrier against the biting cold and damp of the dungeon. Yet rats chewed through those scraps as easily as they chewed wood. In the dead of night, a prisoner might wake to the sound of tearing fabric, only to discover that his blanket had been shredded into nests for vermin. The hems of trousers, the edges of sleeves, even the strips of cloth wrapped around wounds, all became food or bedding for the rodents. This left the captives not only cold but exposed. With their garments eaten away, their skin was more vulnerable to the chill, to dampness, and to the sharp bites of the rats themselves. Those who tried to protect their rags by wrapping them tightly around their bodies found the creatures undeterred. They chewed straight through, nibbling until holes appeared, turning the last symbols of humanity into rags unfit even for beggars. The humiliation of this theft was almost as sharp as the hunger. To be chained in filth, helpless against tormentors, was already unbearable, but to see food stolen from one's very hands, to feel clothes shredded from one's very body, was a cruel reminder of how powerless they had become. A once proud man, stripped of dignity, warmth, and sustenance, was reduced to trembling nakedness, gnawing on nothing while rats feasted in the corners. Some prisoners fought back, trying to crush the vermin beneath their chains or trap them against the walls, yet the rats were endless, multiplying faster than they could be killed. For every one slain, a dozen more appeared, hungrier, bolder, unafraid of human presence. It was not a battle that could be won. In time, even the strongest captives ceased resisting, letting the creatures scavenge at will, too weary to fight for crumbs. The dungeon guards, of course, found amusement in the spectacle. They would toss food into the straw not to feed the men, but to watch rats descend upon it while prisoners struggled against their chains. To them, it was sport, a cruel theatre in which desperation and vermin played the starring roles. To the prisoners, it was a daily confirmation that their lives mattered less than the rats that devoured their last comforts. Worse still, the gnawing and stealing spread disease. Rats chewed through decayed meat and rotting waste before tearing at a prisoner's clothes or stealing his bread. Each bite, each scrap carried sickness, ensuring that even the stolen food, if retrieved, was fouled and dangerous. The very thought of putting it in one's mouth filled men with dread. Hunger forced them to try anyway, and sickness followed. Thus, between the chains that bound them, the air that poisoned them, and the rats that stole their food and warmth, survival in the dungeon was never truly possible. The prisoners were being slowly undone, their strength whittled away day by day, just as their food was gnawed and their rags destroyed. And yet, as cruel as the vermin were, they were but the beginning. For beyond hunger, filth, and rats, even darker agonies awaited in the hands of men, the torturers whose devices were crafted to finish what the dungeon had begun. As if the rats had not already stolen every shred of comfort, their smaller companions made life in the dungeon unbearable in another way. Fleas, lice, and countless crawling insects thrived in the filth, feeding on the prisoners just as greedily as the vermin stole their food. These tiny tormentors were everywhere, hidden in the straw, nesting in the prisoners' hair, burrowed into their rags, and creeping out of cracks in the damp stone. There was no escape, no corner free of their relentless bite. Day and night, the itching never ceased. Fleas leapt from straw to skin, their bites leaving trails of burning welts that grew redder and more inflamed with every passing hour. Lice crawled through hair and beards, laying eggs that hatched into swarms of biting parasites. The constant sensation of movement beneath the skin made men scratch until their nails drew blood. Soon, sores and scabs covered their bodies, worsening the infections that were already spreading unchecked. Sleep, already fragile in the dungeon, became almost impossible. A man might close his eyes, hoping for a moment's peace, only to jerk awake at the sharp sting of insects feeding on his flesh. The scratching of one prisoner would set off a chorus of groans as others clawed at their own bodies in frustration. In the silence of the night, the sound of endless itching became as haunting as the squeaks of rats or the dripping of water. The torment was not only physical, it was psychological. Every bite was a reminder that the prisoners were not masters of their own bodies. Their flesh had become territory, a feast for vermin. The shame was crushing. Men once respected in their villages now sat hunched in filth, scratching like animals, their hair alive with lice, their rags crawling with unseen pests. Some whispered that the insects were eating them alive from the inside out, and in their fevered state they almost believed it. Diseases flourished in these conditions. Fleas carried plague, transferring it from one prisoner to another. Lice spread typhus, a sickness that brought fever, delirium, and death. Insects crawling over rotting waste, then biting into open wounds guaranteed infection. A man could go to sleep scratching at an itch and wake with his flesh swollen, hot, and throbbing from disease. The smallest creatures proved as deadly as the largest chains. Attempts to resist were useless. The prisoners could not bathe. They could not change clothes. They could not even scratch properly with their wrists bound in iron. The insects thrived on their helplessness. Some tried to crush the lice between their nails, but for every one killed, a dozen more hatched in the seams of their rags. Others picked endlessly at their hair, pulling clumps from their scalps in frustration, leaving bald patches and bleeding sores. Still the lice returned, multiplying faster than despair could kill hope. The guards, of course, found it amusing. Watching prisoners squirm and scratch was entertainment. Sometimes they mocked them by comparing them to animals or by pretending to scratch themselves in mimicry. To the guards, the insects were just another layer of humiliation, another way to strip the men of pride. But to the prisoners, this constant biting was a slow death. Not as dramatic as torture, not as sudden as plague, but a steady wearing down of body and mind. Each bite drained strength, each itch stole sleep, each infection brought pain. Together they formed a background of torment that never ceased, a reminder that in the dungeon there was no such thing as peace. And yet, even as vermin feasted on their bodies, the prisoners knew the worst was still ahead, for the dungeon's insects were nature's cruelty. But the devices of man built for deliberate agony would prove far more terrifying than anything nature could unleash. If fleas and lice devoured the flesh of the prisoners, hunger consumed their strength from within. The dungeon was not a place for nourishment. It was a place where food became another weapon of torment. Meals were not meant to sustain life, but to prolong suffering. What little the guards provided came in the form of scraps, stale crusts of bread, so hard they could cut the mouth, and often mouldy, crumbling into dust between trembling fingers. To call it bread was an insult to the word. These scraps were the leftovers of soldiers, sometimes gnawed at first by rats, sometimes soaked in damp, and always thrown into the filth without care. Yet the prisoners clutched at them desperately, knowing that without them death by starvation would come even faster. Chains rattled as men fought over crumbs, each one a pitiful struggle of survival. The body, already weakened by disease, vermin and wounds, began to consume itself. Stomachs growled endlessly, cramps twisting like knives inside. Limbs lost their strength, hands shook uncontrollably, and eyes grew hollow, sinking deep into gaunt faces. The hunger never left. It stalked them day and night, gnawing at their bones more relentlessly than any rat. At first, some tried to ration what little they received. A prisoner might tuck half a crust under his rags, hoping to stretch it into 2 meals, but the rats were never far away. More than once a man reached for his hidden crumb only to find it gone, stolen by the vermin that had chewed straight through his rags to get to it. Others discovered that mould had already claimed their precious food, forcing them to choose between eating rot or letting their stomachs ache in emptiness. Most chose to eat, gagging with every bite, because even foul bread was better than nothing. Water was no comfort. The dungeon supply was brackish and foul, often taken from the same streams that carried waste. Drinking it brought nausea and sickness, yet without it, thirst tightened throats until swallowing became impossible. So the prisoners drank, washing down the dry bread with poison, their stomachs rebelling as survival itself turned against them. The hunger began to affect their minds as much as their bodies. Men spoke of food constantly, whispering about meals they once enjoyed, feasts they had attended, even simple bowls of soup from home. The dungeon twisted these memories into torture. Dreams, when sleep came, were filled with visions of banquets, only to vanish when they awoke to stale crusts on the floor. Some grew delirious, gnawing at their own rags in desperation, mistaking cloth for food in their feverish state. The guards revelled in this misery. Sometimes they dangled fresh loaves of bread before the prisoners, letting the smell of baked wheat drift through the bars before carrying it away untouched. Other times, they ground the scraps into the dirt, forcing men to lick at the floor if they wanted even a taste. Hunger, in their hands, became not just a punishment but a form of humiliation, proof that the captives were less than human. Starvation worked slowly but with certainty. The strongest grew thin, their ribs protruding like bars of their own cage. The weakest collapsed altogether, too frail to lift even the dry bread to their mouths. Death by hunger was not sudden. It was a long unravelling, a steady fading of strength until the prisoner was nothing but bones and shadows. And yet, the scraps were deliberate. The dungeon was not designed to kill too quickly. The bread was just enough to keep men alive, to ensure they lingered in pain, to keep their bodies breathing so that greater cruelties could still be inflicted. Hunger, like the insects and the vermin, was only one thread in the tapestry of torment. But beyond the scraps and the starvation, worse awaited: chains, devices, and human hands that would turn survival itself into a curse. If dry bread scraps tore at the prisoner's hunger, thirst finished what starvation had begun. In the dungeon's suffocating air where moisture clung to the stone but never to the tongue, water was both desperately needed and impossibly scarce. What the guards offered was not refreshment, it was yet another cruelty. Buckets of foul, murky liquid were placed inside the cell, sometimes days apart, filled not with clean water but with a dark, stagnant brew that smelled of rot and disease. To drink it was to invite sickness, yet to refuse it was to invite death. The choice was no choice at all. Lips cracked and throats burned until the prisoners could not resist. With trembling hands, they scooped the filthy water to their mouths, ignoring the taste of decay and the wriggling of unseen insects within it. The liquid coated their tongues with bitterness, leaving their stomachs churning and their bodies racked with nausea. Still they drank, because thirst left them no other option. The source of this water was often the same streams that carried human waste. Guards did not bother with wells or springs. They fetched what was nearest, what was cheapest. Sometimes the buckets were filled with rainwater gathered from gutters, crawling with worms and floating with dirt. Other times, it was water deliberately fouled, mixed with mud or spoiled meat to make it barely drinkable. A cruel guard might spit into the bucket before sliding it into the dungeon, laughing as the captives stared at it with equal parts disgust and longing. The effects were swift and merciless. Bellies cramped after each swallow, doubling men over in pain. Some vomited what they had drunk only to lap it back up again in desperation when the thirst became unbearable. Others developed fevers, their bodies shaking with chills, the water carrying infection through their blood. Dysentery spread quickly, turning the already foul cell into a pit of filth. The stench was overwhelming, and yet the cycle continued. Thirst demanded more, and the prisoners kept drinking. Chains made even this torment worse. Bound hands forced men to crawl across the floor to reach the bucket. They leaned awkwardly, their shackles biting into flesh as they tried to scoop a mouthful. Many slipped and spilled what little was available, watching in horror as the filthy liquid soaked into the straw lost forever. Guards never replaced what was spilled. Instead, they mocked the captives for their clumsiness, reminding them that water in this place was a privilege, not a right. The prisoners grew weaker, their lips permanently stained with grime, their tongues swollen from dehydration. Some hallucinated, imagining they tasted sweet streams or clear wells from their past lives. They licked at the damp stone walls, desperate for drops of moisture, ignoring the slime that came away on their tongues. In the darkest moments, men competed with rats for the smallest puddles, lowering their faces to the ground to lap up water the vermin had already touched. The humiliation of thirst broke men as surely as chains. To be reduced to drinking what animals refused, to beg for liquid that poisoned rather than nourished, stripped away the last remnants of dignity. It was not only the body that suffered, but the spirit. Each swallow reminded them they were prisoners, powerless, degraded, drinking death to delay death. And yet, like the stale bread, the filthy water was calculated. It was never enough to kill swiftly. It was enough to prolong the agony, to keep men alive while breaking them piece by piece. Their bodies wasted away, their stomachs knotted with disease, but their lungs still breathed, their hearts still beat. The dungeon wanted them living, because the true horrors, man-made, deliberate, crafted with iron and cruelty, still waited in the shadows. The prisoners were never meant to grow strong within the dungeon's walls. Each day the scraps of bread and the buckets of filthy water ate away at them, not by nourishment but by slow decay. Starvation was not a sudden blow, it was a daily theft, a steady draining of strength that left men hollow, both in body and in spirit. In the beginning, the hunger gnawed like a restless animal inside their bellies. They clutched their stomachs, hoping the cramps would ease, hoping that tomorrow might bring more than stale crusts. But tomorrow never changed. Each day offered the same pitiful scraps, and with each passing sunrise, though the prisoners could never see the sun, their bodies consumed more of themselves. Muscles thinned, bones pushed against skin, and once strong men became frail shadows. Shackles that had cut into flesh now dangled loose around wrists grown thin. A prisoner's walk, once steady even in chains, turned into a stumbling crawl, each step costing him more than he had to give. Hunger was patient. It did not strike quickly, but it never let go. It wore them down until even the act of breathing seemed an effort. Their faces told the story. Cheeks sank in, eyes dulled, lips cracked and bloodied from thirst. Teeth loosened, gums bled, and hair fell away in clumps. Some prisoners, once healthy and proud, now looked like skeletons draped in rags, their ribs pressing against their chest with every shallow breath. They were alive only in the most technical sense. Their hearts still beat, but their bodies no longer had strength for anything beyond suffering. Starvation changed their minds as much as their flesh. At first they spoke of food constantly, remembering meals from their past, describing the taste of meat, the warmth of stew, the sweetness of fruit. These conversations offered a kind of comfort, a way to imagine themselves outside the dungeon. But as days stretched into weeks, the talk grew quieter, memories faded, words slurred. Men forgot the taste of food, forgot the feel of fullness. Their entire world became the ache in their bellies and the chains around their wrists. Desperation drove some to madness. A man might gnaw at the leather straps of his shackles, trying to chew them as though they were meat. Another might scrape moss from the damp stones, swallowing it in handfuls only to retch it back up moments later. Others ate lice or insects caught in their straw, too far gone to feel shame. The body demanded fuel, and the dungeon offered only filth. The guards noticed this decline, and they encouraged it. They would toss scraps into the straw, watching prisoners scramble like dogs for crumbs. Sometimes they withheld food entirely, forcing captives to go days without a bite. To the jailers, hunger was not a failure of mercy. It was a tool, as effective as chains or whips. A starving prisoner could not fight. A starving prisoner could not resist. He could only obey, too weak to raise his head, too desperate to do anything but submit. Disease thrived in this weakness. The immune systems of the captives collapsed under the strain of constant hunger. Minor wounds grew deadly. Fevers took hold quickly. A cough that might have been harmless outside the dungeon turned into pneumonia within. Starvation did not kill alone. It invited other killers inside, opening the body to plague, infection, and despair. Yet starvation had a cruel balance. It never completely destroyed, not at once. The guards gave just enough food to keep the captives alive, just enough to ensure their suffering could continue another day. The dungeon was not a place of mercy. It was a place designed to prolong agony. And so, each day, the prisoners felt themselves wasting away, their strength slipping, their hope thinning, their bodies weakened, their voices quieted, and their eyes dimmed. But the dungeon was not finished with them yet. For once, starvation had drained them of resistance. The next phase of torment began. Torture, crafted not by nature but by human hands, designed to shatter what little spirit starvation had left behind. By the time starvation and disease had reduced the prisoners to hollow shells, the dungeon revealed its true horrors. The chains, the vermin, the foul air, these were only the prelude. What awaited in the shadows were instruments built not by nature but by human cruelty, devices forged in iron and designed with one purpose, to break the body and shatter the spirit. Among these, few were as feared as the iron claws and the bone-crushing racks. The iron claws, sometimes called the cat's paw, were weapons of precision torment. Forged from steel and shaped into hooked talons, they were heated in fire until they glowed red. Then, in the torchlit chambers, the claws were raked across a prisoner's flesh. Skin tore like parchment, muscles shredded, and the smell of burning filled the air. Men screamed until their throats were raw, their voices reduced to whispers of agony. There was no escape. The claws dug into every surface of their bodies, arms, legs, chest, even faces. The claws were not always heated. Sometimes they were used cold, driven into flesh to rip away skin in strips. The guards favoured this method for slow torture, watching their victims writhe as each movement tore fresh wounds. Infection was inevitable, and the dungeon's filth ensured that survivors often suffered longer deaths than those who bled out quickly. To the torturers, this was not punishment. It was entertainment, a performance in which pain was the language and screams were the music. Yet even the claws paled beside the rack, the most infamous of all medieval devices. Built of heavy wood and iron, the rack stretched prisoners until their very bodies betrayed them. Chains bound wrists and ankles, and with every turn of the wheel, the limbs were pulled farther apart. At first, joints popped painfully from their sockets. Then ligaments tore, muscles split, and bones cracked under the relentless strain. The screams from the rack echoed through stone corridors, chilling even those who had already endured its torment. The sound was not human. It was something primal, a voice torn from the deepest pit of suffering. Some captives begged for death after the first pull, while others held out, hoping to survive. But the rack was patient, and it always won. The most terrifying cruelty of the rack was that it was rarely used to kill. The torturers preferred to stop just short of death, leaving the prisoner broken but alive. Dislocated shoulders, shattered knees, and twisted spines ensured that the victim would never walk or move properly again. Survivors were left crippled, dragged back to their cells to serve as reminders to others of what resistance brought. For those who endured both the claws and the rack, the body was left in ruins. Torn skin bled into straw, bones jutted at unnatural angles, and joints hung uselessly from sockets. The pain never ended. It throbbed through every breath, every twitch, every attempt to shift position in the chains. Sleep became impossible, rest unimaginable. The dungeon had succeeded not just in harming, but in dismantling the human body piece by piece. But perhaps worse than the physical torment was the knowledge that the devices were deliberate. Rats, fleas, and starvation were cruel, but they belonged to nature and neglect. The iron claws and the racks, however, were born of human hands, built with careful thought, with the intention to inflict the greatest suffering possible. This realization broke prisoners in ways hunger and filth never could. They were not simply dying, they were being unmade, body and soul, by men who considered it their duty and amusement. And yet, as terrible as the claws and the racks were, they were only the beginning of the dungeon's arsenal. Other devices waited in the shadows. Wheels, boots, cages, and spikes, each crafted to explore new depths of agony. For in the dungeon, pain was endless, and death was a mercy rarely given. The rack and the iron claws had a terrible elegance to them, machines of measured torment, but the spiked boards were blunt, merciless instruments, meant not only to hurt, but to humiliate and terrorize in the most immediate way. Brought from a shadowed room lined with hooks and iron, they were simple in purpose. A plank studded with cruel points, arranged so that a human body could be stretched or laid upon it, and the spikes would pierce and rend whatever skin lay against them. The thought of it made men who had endured everything else go cold. They did not use the spiked boards as a distant punishment. Their cruelty was intimate. A prisoner was dragged from his cell, already hollowed by hunger, chained and sick, and forced onto the plank. Straps held him down so that he could not flinch. Hands that once held tools and letters were bound and useless. The guards leaned close, not out of necessity, but for the pleasure of watching a man's face contort as the first weight of his own body met those points. The spikes were not always driven to fatal depth. Often they were arranged to tear, to hold, to assure that every breath pulled at the wound. Pain here had no rhythm or pretense of purpose. It was sudden and shredding. When a body landed, the spikes found the soft places: the arms, the back, the flanks. Flesh gave way with sickening resistance, and the prisoner's cry filled the chamber, jagged and raw. The sound of tearing flesh mixed with the clatter of chains and the measured footsteps of those who watched. Some guards worked methodically, turning the board just so, pressing additional weight to increase torment. Others were crueler still, adding heat to the metal points or pressing salted rags into the wounds to make the pain linger. The wounds from the spikes were especially dangerous in that place. In the fresh air, such injuries might be wrapped and cared for. Here, in the dungeon's wet dark, they were invitations to infection. Blood soaked into straw already stained with rot, flies and lice. Descended. What should have been quick cauterization or clean bandaging became a slow, festering injury. Men who were pinned to the board returned to their cells marked with new open wounds that would not close. Infection crept silently afterward, and fever followed as surely as shadow follows dusk. But the physical agony was only half the crime. The spiked board's true aim was to humiliate, to reduce a man to a shape on a plank, to strip him of dignity, to show others what resistance would bring. Neighbours in adjacent cells could hear everything: the groans, the pleading, the way a man's breathing changed from defiance to surrender. Those sounds were lessons. The keepers made sure they echoed. Prisoners who survived the board were changed irrevocably. Their backs were maps of pain, their movements guarded and small, their voices quieter. The very act of eating, of turning in sleep, of leaning against stone, reminded them of the spikes. Sometimes the board served as spectacle. On rare occasions, a prisoner was displayed publicly on the plank for a short time, so that visitors, nobles, clerks, even a cruelly curious merchant, could look and gasp at the evidence of punishment. The sight of a man held open by iron points, eyes wide and searching for mercy, was intended to reassure the powerful that their order would be maintained. Inside the dungeon, such displays spread fear faster than any whip. Those who survived the board rarely returned to the same existence. The wounds left scars that tore with every movement, muscles around the injuries weakened and nerves burned. For many, the spikes had not only taken flesh, but had broken the will to stand up, to speak, or to plan escape. The board's work was complete the moment the prisoner lost the certainty that he could be anything but a thing. And yet, even the spiked boards were not the dungeon's final cruelty. For every new device taught a new form of helplessness, and every fresh wound deepened the silence. The prisoners who had once dared to hope now learned a harder lesson: that in a place designed to erase the self, survival itself could be the cruelest fate. If the spiked board shredded the flesh, then the stretching machines aimed at something even more terrible. They sought to dismantle the human body itself, joint by joint, sinew by sinew. These instruments of torture, often called the rack or its grim cousins, were the dungeon's most feared devices. Their design was brutally simple: a long wooden frame with rollers at either end, ropes tied to the victim's wrists and ankles. With every turn of the wheel, the body was pulled further, and the silence between each creak of the ropes became more unbearable than the screams themselves. The prisoner, already weakened by starvation, foul water, and festering wounds, was dragged onto the machine like a broken doll. Shackles held his wrists, clamps bound his ankles, and his body was stretched across the wooden beam. At first, there was only pressure, a pulling sensation deep inside the arms and legs. But the executioner, stone-faced and unhurried, would twist the rollers further. The body resisted, then yielded, with sickening cracks as shoulders dislocated, hips slipped from their sockets, and ribs strained against their cage. Every breath became torture, not because the lungs lacked air, but because the chest itself felt as if it were being torn open with invisible hands. The victims' cries filled the chamber, and though others in their cells could not see the device, they could hear its cruel language. The thrum of tightened rope, the groan of wood, the abrupt snapping sound when a tendon gave way. But the rack was not a device of quick endings. It was a theatre of pain, designed for prolonging the moment where hope died. The torturer would pause often, leaving the prisoner trembling on the frame, dangling between unbearable pain and the fear of what was to come next. Then another twist. Muscles stretched beyond their limit tore violently, skin bruised black and blue as blood vessels ruptured beneath the surface. Fingers curled into claws, toes bent at unnatural angles, and the victim's own body became unrecognizable to him. Sometimes the torturer would ask questions during the ordeal, though it was not truth he sought. Answers were irrelevant. The machine was the answer. Confessions wrung from men under such agony were as broken as their bones. They admitted to crimes they had never dreamed of, named friends and enemies alike, or begged for death with words that scarcely made sense. The rack cared nothing for truth, only for submission. When the stretching finally ended, what returned to the cell was scarcely a man. Shoulders hung uselessly, arms dangled like wet cloth, and legs dragged behind in twisted angles. Some never walked again, their spines permanently damaged. Others lingered in their chains, screaming in their sleep, unable to lift even a piece of bread to their mouths. And for many, infection set in where the skin had torn, leading to a slow, fevered death in the dark. The horror of the rack spread far beyond the victim. Prisoners who heard the sounds but never saw the device filled the silence with their own imagination, and imagination was often worse. They whispered to each other of men pulled until their bodies split in two, of spines snapped like twigs, of limbs wrenched so far that they could no longer be called human. Fear of the rack gnawed at their sanity, making them obey without resistance, crushing hope before the torturer's hand even reached for the wheel. What made the machine so monstrous was not only its power to destroy the body, but its slow, methodical way of doing so. Unlike the blade of an axe or the point of a sword, the rack did not kill cleanly. It dismantled a human being piece by piece, leaving behind not a corpse but a shattered life, proof of the dungeon's purpose, not swift justice, but prolonged despair. And, yet even after the body was broken, the dungeon had more horrors to reveal. For those who survived, the rack discovered that sometimes the most unendurable agony was not what the machine did to the flesh, but what the silence afterward did to the mind. The dungeon's devices had done their part, tearing flesh, snapping bones, unravelling muscle from bone. But for many prisoners, the worst punishment of all came not from iron or wood, but from something far less visible, endless days of solitary darkness. It was not the sudden burst of pain that crushed them here, but the silence, the stillness, the emptiness that crept inside their minds and gnawed at their sanity like rats at a corpse. A man could be taken from the rack or the spiked board and placed alone in a narrow cell, barely wide enough to stretch his arms. The door slammed shut, and with it, the world disappeared. There were no windows, no torches, no slivers of daylight seeping through cracks. The darkness was so complete that even the prisoner's own hands vanished from sight. He would wave them before his eyes, desperate to prove that he still existed, but the void swallowed everything. At first, the prisoner would try to fight it. He would whisper to himself, hum old songs, or count the seconds between the drips of water leaking from the ceiling. But soon, time itself unravelled. Was it day or night, hours or weeks? The dungeon never answered. In the darkness, the mind began to play cruel tricks. Shadows appeared where there was no light. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. Voices whispered, sometimes kind, sometimes mocking, until the prisoner no longer knew if they came from outside or from his own skull. The body too began to betray him. The damp stone floor seeped cold into his bones, and his muscles, already weakened by starvation and chains, grew stiff from lack of movement. Sleep came in broken fragments, chased by nightmares more vivid than waking. Sometimes he woke screaming, certain that hands had been gripping his throat, only to find nothing but silence pressing against his ears. Other times he thought rats scurried across his skin, though when he struck at them his hands met only air. But the worst enemy was the mind itself. Alone in the dark, a man began to relive his life. Regrets sharpened, memories twisted, guilt resurfaced with unbearable clarity. A thief might recall every coin he had stolen, imagining endless retribution. A soldier might see again the faces of the men he had killed. Some tried to pray, begging for God's light, but even prayer seemed to dissolve into the blackness. For many, faith withered faster than flesh. The guards knew the power of solitary darkness. They didn't need whips or chains here. They simply left a man in silence long enough, and he would destroy himself. Some prisoners were reduced to babbling, muttering fragments of words to invisible companions. Others clawed at the stone walls until their fingers bled, desperate for proof that something real existed beyond the void. A few lost even that urge, sitting motionless for hours, then days, their minds broken into pieces too small to gather again. When the door finally opened, the light was blinding. Even a single torch seared the prisoners' eyes, and many shrank from it like creatures of the underworld. Some sobbed at the sight of another human face, even if it was a guard's sneering one. Others laughed uncontrollably, a madness born from too long in silence. And some refused to leave the darkness at all, clutching at their cell as though it were safer than the world outside. This was the true cruelty of solitary confinement. It did not kill the body, but it unmade the soul. A man might enter the cell human, but he often left it something less, hollow, broken, his will dissolved in the endless black. And unlike wounds of flesh, the scars of solitude could not be healed. For in that medieval dungeon, the darkest prison was not the one built of stone, but the one built inside the prisoner's own mind. If solitary darkness gnawed at the mind in silence, then the constant fear of death and punishment was the ever-present shadow that walked beside every prisoner, even when no torturer stood in sight. The dungeon was not merely a place of stone and chains, it was a theatre of dread, where death could come slowly by disease, swiftly by execution, or unpredictably at the whim of a guard. This fear seeped into every heartbeat, every breath, until the prisoners no longer lived as men but as trembling shells waiting for the inevitable. Every sound in the corridor became a herald of doom. The rattle of keys, the creak of boots, or the clang of iron doors sent waves of panic through the captives. A guard might enter at any time, pointing randomly to a man who would be dragged away to the rack, the spiked board, or perhaps never seen again. No explanation was given. No reason was required. The prisoners learned that justice had no place here, only the rule of cruelty. Night offered no relief. Many lay awake, listening to the groans of those tortured before them, wondering if they would be called next. The darkness pressed down with heavy silence, broken suddenly by screams that rose and fell like the howling of lost souls. Each cry was a reminder. Pain waited, and death was never far. Some men prayed feverishly, clutching their chains as if they were rosaries, while others cursed the world that had abandoned them. But death itself was not the only fear. Often, the punishment was worse than execution. The rack pulled bodies apart until they were useless husks. Spiked boards ripped open flesh. Solitary confinement tore at sanity. The guards understood this and exploited it mercilessly. Sometimes they would whisper through the bars at night, promising that a man's turn was tomorrow, dragging out his terror for hours, only to leave him untouched. The prisoner would collapse in exhaustion. Relief mingled with shame, knowing he had begged for mercy that never came. Food and water became part of the torment. Prisoners feared eating scraps of bread, wondering if it had been laced with something foul. They feared drinking filthy water, knowing it could sicken them yet, unable to resist thirst. Even sleep was haunted, for nightmares often felt more real than waking. And when morning came, if morning could be known in that sunless place, it brought no peace, only another day of waiting for the hand of punishment. The fear was not confined to the dungeon itself. Tales of execution haunted every mind. Men hanged in the courtyard for the crowd's amusement, burned alive in public squares, or left to rot on gibbets where crows plucked their flesh. Prisoners imagined their own fate constantly, rehearsing in their heads the moment of death, their last words the cold touch of rope or steel. Some grew so consumed by dread that they welcomed death as a release, whispering into the dark, "Better today than tomorrow." And yet, the cruelest aspect of this fear was how it broke the bonds between prisoners. Trust eroded quickly when survival was uncertain. Men suspected each other of betraying secrets to gain leniency. Whispers of informants spread like poison, and sometimes one prisoner's fear became another's downfall. The dungeon thrived on this, using terror not only to punish but to divide. Over time, fear itself became the true torturer. It was not the iron shackles that bound them most tightly, but the endless dread of what was to come. Minds withered under its weight, until some men confessed to crimes they had never committed just to hasten their end, while others lost all sense of reality, their thoughts a jumble of death, punishment, and despair. In that medieval dungeon, life was not measured in days or years, but in moments between terrors. And the cruelest truth of all was that the fear never ended, even for those who died. For the screams they left behind became the inheritance of the living, echoing in stone halls where punishment was always waiting. The dungeon's stones were merciless, but what they crushed most effectively was not the flesh, it was the mind. Every cruelty that came before, darkness, starvation, filthy water, festering wounds, and the constant fear of death, was a chisel, chipping away at sanity piece by piece. Time itself, stretched thin in that windowless pit, became the hammer that finally shattered the human spirit. Men entered the dungeon as thieves, rebels, or unlucky enemies of power, but as the days bled into weeks and weeks into months, many ceased to be men at all. They became shadows, husks of who they once were. At first, the signs were subtle. A prisoner would mutter to himself in the dark, whispering fragments of conversations long past. He might hum a tune from childhood, repeating it endlessly as if clinging to a single thread of memory could hold his world together. But soon, the muttering turned to shouting, the humming into screams. Memories twisted into hallucinations. A man would insist his mother stood at the bars, or that angels glowed in the corners of the cell. Another would laugh uncontrollably, his voice echoing unnaturally against the damp walls. The dungeon magnified madness. The drip of water became unbearable, like a mocking clock ticking away eternity. The squeak of rats, the rustle of lice, even the faint breathing of other prisoners in distant cells, all grew into tormenting sounds that clawed at the mind. Some prisoners clawed at their own ears, desperate to silence the echoes. Others welcomed the voices in their heads, treating them as companions in the void. Insanity offered comfort where reality offered none. Hunger and thirst pushed the mind further into collapse. Men dreamed of feasts and fountains, waking to find themselves chewing straw or licking slime from the walls. A prisoner might imagine he was free walking through fields, only to crash against the iron bars of his cell and split his forehead open. The guards saw these breakdowns as entertainment. They would mock the babbling madman, sometimes tossing scraps of food just out of reach, laughing as broken prisoners crawled like animals. Worse still were the moments when madness turned violent. In shared cells, prisoners turned on one another, driven by paranoia and desperation. A whispered word could be mistaken for betrayal, a glance for a threat. Men attacked each other with bare hands, gnashing teeth and shackled fists. The dungeon floor ran with blood not only from torture but from the collapse of human bonds. And afterward, the survivors sat in silence, staring blankly, no longer recognizing themselves or their companions. For those left in solitary darkness, insanity took a slower, colder path. Days without sight stripped away their sense of self. They forgot the shape of their own bodies, the sound of their own voices. Some pressed their faces against the wall for hours, convinced someone was waiting on the other side. Others rocked endlessly, back and forth, until their spines bent and their muscles withered. By the time the door opened, they were more ghost than man, blinded by light, trembling like wild beasts pulled from their burrows. The cruel truth of the dungeon was that death was not always its goal. Often, survival itself was the punishment. To be alive meant to lose one's mind slowly, to feel memory dissolve, to watch reason crumble. Those who survived the iron claws and the stretching rack often did not survive themselves. Their minds fractured into pieces too jagged to mend. In the end, madness was the dungeon's greatest victory. Iron could chain the body, but insanity chained the soul forever. A man freed from his cell might walk into the daylight, but the dungeon remained inside him, its whispers and shadows etched into every thought. And so, though their bodies wasted in the stone, their sanity was the true prisoner, lost, broken, and never returning. In a dungeon already ruled by darkness, hunger, and despair, the threat of torture was not limited to great machines of iron and wood. Sometimes the cruelty was far simpler, far more immediate, brutal beatings delivered for the smallest mistakes. These punishments needed no elaborate preparation, no tools beyond a guard's fists, boots, or clubs. They were sudden, merciless explosions of violence meant to remind every prisoner that survival was not theirs to claim. It was a fragile mercy, dangling at the whim of those who held the keys. The smallest misstep could bring blows crashing down. If a prisoner failed to rise quickly enough when ordered, the guard struck him. If he spilled a scrap of filthy water, he was kicked until his ribs screamed. Even breathing too loudly, whispering to another prisoner, or failing to bow his head in submission was seen as insolence worthy of pain. The rules were never clear, for that was part of the torment. The prisoners could never predict what act might draw punishment. Their only certainty was that it could come at any moment. The beatings themselves were savage and unrelenting. Guards carried heavy wooden clubs, iron rods, or whips knotted with sharp tips. Sometimes they used nothing but their boots, stomping on already weak and shackled men until blood flowed across the stones. The dungeon echoed with the dull thuds of flesh meeting wood, the sharp cracks of bone breaking, and the cries of prisoners who had already forgotten what mercy felt like. And when the prisoner fell silent, unconscious or too broken to scream, the guards often struck harder, determined to leave their mark not only on the body but on the soul. To make the punishment worse, beatings were often public. Men were dragged from their cells into the corridors or central chambers so that others could watch. Every strike against one body became a warning to the rest. Prisoners huddled in their chains, staring at the floor, trying to block out the sight of their companion's blood spattering across the stones. But there was no blocking out the sound of ribs cracking, or the smell of iron and sweat that lingered afterward. The dungeon used fear like a whip, and each beating carved that fear deeper into the minds of all who witnessed it. For the victim, recovery was almost impossible. In the cold, damp air, bruises stiffened into agony, and wounds refused to heal. Blood poisoned the straw bedding. Infections spread quickly. There were no bandages, no ointments, no clean water, only chains and silence. A man who had been beaten often spent days lying motionless, unable to move his broken limbs, tormented by hunger and thirst he could not satisfy. And still, even in such weakness, the threat remained. Another mistake, another strike. The cruelty was not only physical but deliberate humiliation. Guards mocked the prisoners as they struck them, laughing, spitting, calling them animals. Sometimes they forced others to join in, ordering one prisoner to strike another under threat of worse punishment if he refused. In this way, the dungeon twisted bonds of trust into bonds of betrayal, breaking not just bones, but the fragile unity that could have kept hope alive. Over time, the prisoners learned to live in constant anticipation of violence. They flinched at footsteps, trembled at the clink of keys, and dared not raise their eyes when a guard passed. Fear became as natural as breathing, and yet, even submission offered no safety. The dungeon thrived on chaos, on the knowledge that pain could come without reason. That was the true lesson of the beatings. There was no justice, no fairness, no way to earn safety. There was only suffering, waiting at every turn. And as the bruises multiplied and bones grew weaker, the beatings left more than scars on the body. They carved deep marks into the mind, teaching each prisoner that he was no longer a man, but an object, broken, silent, and disposable. Not every prisoner in the medieval dungeon was equal. For all its filth, chains, and cruelty, the dungeon reflected the world above. Wealth spoke, and power whispered even in the darkest corners. While the poor and forgotten rotted on damp stone floors, some wealthy prisoners managed to bend the rules with bribes, buying themselves small but significant privileges that set them apart from their starving, broken companions. The bribery often began the very night of imprisonment. A nobleman, a merchant, or anyone with family connections might press a ring into a guard's hand before the cell door closed. Gold coins hidden in boots, or sewn into cloaks found their way into the pockets of jailers who were eager for profit. Even prisoners without money on their person relied on promises, letters sent to families, pledges of estates or jewels, to secure better treatment. The guards, corrupt and underpaid, rarely refused such offers. The results were stark. While most prisoners survived on mouldy bread and foul water, a wealthy man might receive a loaf of fresh bread, a flask of wine, or even roasted meat smuggled in by a sympathetic guard. Where others slept on damp straw alive with lice, the rich might rest on a wool blanket or even a rough mattress. Some bribed their way into larger cells, or at least secured more light from a torch hung by their door. In a place where hope was as scarce as clean air, these small comforts could mean the difference between surviving and wasting away. But these privileges were never free from danger. Every bribe demanded silence, yet silence was hard to keep. Other prisoners noticed quickly when one man seemed stronger, better fed, or less desperate. Envy spread like infection, gnawing at what little unity remained. Whispers of betrayal filled the cells. He eats while we starve. He drinks while we choke on filth. Guards encouraged this bitterness, for division among captives made their control absolute. Some prisoners, driven mad by hunger, tried to steal the wealthy man's food or blankets. Fights broke out in the dark, men clawing each other with shackled hands for a crust of bread. The guards rarely intervened. They watched with amusement, knowing that bribery kept order in its own twisted way, by turning prisoners against each other rather than against their keepers. The wealthy were not immune to fear either. Privilege did not erase the threat of torture, only delayed it. A nobleman might purchase softer treatment for a month, but when his gold ran out or his family failed to pay, the rack awaited him just as it awaited the poorest beggar. In fact, guards often used privilege as a crueler weapon. They would offer better food or freedom from beatings, only to snatch it away when payments ceased, forcing the wealthy man to sink into the same misery he had once escaped. The fall from comfort into filth was often more devastating than never having had comfort at all. At times, bribery reached grotesque levels. Some prisoners bought the right to walk outside their cells for a few minutes, shackles clinking as they stretched stiff limbs in a corridor. Others bribed to avoid certain punishments, watching silently as their poorer cellmates were dragged away instead. In the cruelest cases, a wealthy man might even pay to have another prisoner take his place under torture. Guards eager for coin agreed, uncaring who screamed so long as someone did. For the poor prisoners, this inequality deepened despair. It reminded them that even in chains, even beneath stone ceilings without sunlight, the world's hierarchy remained unbroken. Their hunger grew sharper when they smelled roasted meat in the air, their thirst more unbearable when they heard the cork of a wine flask. The dungeon was not only a place of suffering, it was a place where suffering itself could be bought and sold, and yet bribery did not guarantee survival. Gold could delay death, soften the chains, or lighten the darkness, but it could not erase the dungeon's truth. In the end, flesh was still flesh, fear was still fear, and no amount of wealth could forever silence the sound of approaching footsteps in the night. In the dungeons of the medieval world, wealth was not just an advantage, it was survival itself. While the wealthy bought privileges with gold and jewels, the poor prisoners bore the full crushing weight of misery. They had no coins hidden in their boots, no family estates to bargain with, no influence to soften the hands of the guards. Their fate was harsher, their treatment crueler, and their suffering endless. The poor were always thrown into the darkest corners. Their cells were smaller, often packed with more bodies than space allowed. Where a noble might share with one or two others, a poor man might be crammed into a chamber with 10 or 20 souls, each one gasping for air in the foul, heavy atmosphere. Straw on the ground was seldom replaced. It rotted beneath their weight, crawling with lice and fleas until it became more filth than bedding. For these prisoners, even lying down to sleep meant sinking into decay. Food, too, was an arena of inequality. Guards tossed scraps to the poor like one might feed dogs, hard crusts of stale bread, sometimes already chewed by rats. Water came in cracked pots, often cloudy, sometimes green with rot. If meat was ever offered, it was usually spoiled, crawling with maggots. The poor could not bribe for better. They ate what was thrown at them or starved slowly, their ribs pressing against pale skin, their muscles wasting away. The guards treated the poor as playthings. Beatings were a daily occurrence. given not for disobedience but for amusement. A guard might strike a shackled man simply to watch him collapse, then laugh at his moans. Some poor prisoners were forced to carry heavy buckets of waste from one cell to another, their chains rattling as they trudged through filth. Others were locked in stress positions, standing, crouching or hanging, for hours, sometimes days, until their bodies screamed in pain. The wealthy could buy their way out of such punishments. The poor endured them without hope. Even in torture, the division was clear. A noble might be given a chance to bribe his way free from the rack or the iron claws, but the poor had nothing to offer, and so they became the first victims. Guards dragged them into chambers as examples, their screams echoing through the halls as warnings to others. If the wealthy occasionally took their place through bribery, it was the poor who filled the void, writhing, bleeding, broken. Disease struck the poor first and hardest. Cramped together, weakened by hunger, they had no defences. Fevers raged through their ranks, spreading from one shivering body to the next. The wealthy might receive herbs or cleaner bedding through bribes, but the poor had no such protection. Their wounds festered without care, their coughs filled the air, and death claimed them quickly. Guards rarely bothered to remove their corpses immediately. Sometimes, the living were forced to share space with the dead until the stench became unbearable. What made this suffering worse was the constant reminder of inequality. A poor man might catch sight of a noble eating better food, or lying on a blanket while he shivered on bare stone. That sight burned deeper than hunger. It reminded him that in the dungeon, just as in the world above, he was considered worth less. His pain was entertainment, his life expendable. Yet, despite all this cruelty, the poor prisoners clung to one thing the wealthy often lost: each other. With no gold to buy favours, they shared what little they had: half a crust of bread, a few sips of water, the warmth of pressed bodies in the cold. They whispered stories, sang broken songs, or prayed together in the dark. In their unity, they found a flicker of strength that no amount of gold could purchase. Still, such strength could only go so far. Guards exploited their weakness, nobles ignored their suffering, and the dungeon consumed them day by day. The poor faced harsher treatment not by chance but by design, for the dungeon was a reflection of the world. Those without wealth were left to rot, while those with means bought time. In the end, the poor prisoners' lives burned out faster, their suffering deeper, their names forgotten in the silence of the stone walls. Hunger was the first enemy of every prisoner in the medieval dungeon, and disease followed close behind. Together they were a merciless pair, claiming lives day after day, until the dungeon itself seemed like a graveyard carved into stone. For the poor, whose treatment was harsher, and whose bodies were already weakened, death often came quickly. Yet even the wealthy, despite their bribes, could not escape forever. The dungeon had a way of breaking down every defence, until flesh, bone, and spirit gave way. Meals were scarce, if they could even be called meals. A prisoner might receive nothing more than a crust of dry bread once or twice a day, tossed through the bars by a guard who cared little whether it reached hungry hands or the filthy ground. Many prisoners fought over the scraps like starving animals, clawing at one another in desperation. The bread was often mouldy, sometimes hard enough to break a tooth. On the rare occasion meat was provided, it was spoiled, crawling with worms or stinking of rot. Even water, the very essence of life, offered no relief. It was drawn from filthy sources, filled with silt, insects, or the waste of rats. To drink it was to swallow disease, but to refuse it was to wither from thirst. Hunger gnawed at the body day and night. Prisoners grew thinner, their cheeks hollow, their eyes sunken. Their bones pressed against skin like sharp edges, and every movement became painful. The weaker ones collapsed first, no longer able to rise from the damp stone floor. They drifted into unconsciousness, sometimes muttering delirious words before slipping into silence forever. There was no burial, no ceremony. Guards dragged the bodies away only when the stench grew unbearable, leaving others to wonder who would be next. Disease spread faster than hunger could kill. In the close, airless chambers, sickness moved like wildfire. A single cough might echo into every corner, and within days many would be coughing the same. Fevers burned through the night, leaving prisoners drenched in sweat and shivering with chills. Wounds from shackles or beatings festered, the flesh swelling with pus, turning black at the edges. With no medicine, no healer, and no care, these wounds became slow executions. The foul air itself seemed poisonous. The smell of waste, rotting food and unwashed bodies created a breeding ground for infection. Fleas, lice and rats carried plagues from one prisoner to another, biting, burrowing and spreading sickness in every cell. Some prisoners developed boils and sores that never healed. Others wasted away with fevers that made them scream in delirium. The dungeon echoed with coughing, groaning, and the rattling breath of those on the edge of death. For many, death was not sudden, but stretched out over days or weeks. A man might watch his cellmate wither beside him, too weak to eat, too weak to speak, until one morning he no longer moved. Some prisoners prayed for release, begging for death as a mercy. Others clung stubbornly to life, scraping the last crumbs from the floor, licking drops of condensation from the walls, doing anything to survive another hour. Even wealth could not shield prisoners forever. Bribes bought fresher food and cleaner water, but once sickness entered the body there was little hope. A nobleman with gold could not cure a fever that burned his brain, nor could he pay off the rats that gnawed at his wounds. Death cared little for rank. It came for the poor first, but eventually it came for all. The dungeon was not only a place of punishment, it was a machine of death. Hunger hollowed the body, disease devoured what remained. For every prisoner who tried to endure, 10 more succumbed to the slow torture of starvation and sickness. Their cries faded, their names forgotten, until only silence remained, broken by the footsteps of guards dragging corpses through the corridors. In the end, hunger and disease were the true jailers of the medieval dungeon, harsher than any iron shackle or whip. They worked without pause, invisible and unstoppable, turning the dungeon into a tomb long before the walls themselves crumbled with age. If hunger and disease killed silently, torture destroyed openly. The dungeon was not only a place of decay, it was also a stage where cruelty was performed, where guards and executioners turned human suffering into a display of dominance. Those who survived torture rarely returned whole. Their bodies carried wounds that never healed, their bones broken, their minds scarred forever. To be dragged back into a cell after such torment was not survival, but another form of punishment, living on as a broken body in a place that had no mercy. The torture chamber was a world apart from the dark, cramped cells. There, the air reeked of burned flesh, blood, and rusted iron. Prisoners were dragged in chains across the stone floor, their screams echoing even before the devices touched them. They knew what awaited: the bone-crushing racks, the iron claws, the spiked boards, all designed not to kill quickly, but to break a man piece by piece. When a prisoner was stretched on the rack, his joints cracked, muscles tore, and bones snapped under the relentless pull. Some fainted from the pain, others stayed awake, shrieking until their voices gave out. When the torture was finished, they were dumped back into the cells, limbs twisted, shoulders dislocated, bodies trembling uncontrollably. Walking was impossible, and even lying still brought agony. Shackles pressed into fresh wounds, turning pain into constant torture, even without the executioner's hand. The iron claws left prisoners shredded. Flesh hung loose where skin had been ripped away, and infection set in quickly. Guards did not care. They threw the wounded onto damp straw, where rats and insects fed on the open wounds. The screams of tortured men echoed through the nights, blending with the coughs of the sick and the cries of the starving. Prisoners who endured, spiked boards or whips returned with backs striped in blood, their flesh split so deeply that bones sometimes showed through. These wounds rarely healed, instead they festered in the dungeon's filth. Fever followed, and many died days later, consumed not by the torture itself, but by the infection that crept through their bodies. Even those who lived on carried broken bodies that marked them as different. Some dragged twisted legs behind them, unable to walk without crawling. Others lost the use of arms or fingers, unable to feed themselves without help. Blindness from hot irons or shattered jaws from clubs reduced men to shadows of their former selves. They became burdens to their fellow prisoners, though rarely did anyone turn them away. Misery bound the captives together, even when their suffering weighed heavily on all. The guards viewed these broken bodies not with pity, but with satisfaction. For them, torture was not only a method of punishment, but also a tool of control. A prisoner who returned crippled served as a living warning to the others. resist, and this will be your fate. The broken bodies crawling through the corridors moaning in pain were reminders that there was no escape, not even in survival. Some prisoners envied the dead more than the living tortured. Death was final, swift in comparison to endless agony. To survive torture was to live in a body that betrayed itself, to feel pain in every movement, to be chained not only by iron but by flesh that no longer worked. Yet, even in brokenness, a few clung stubbornly to life. They whispered prayers, sang hoarse songs, or simply endured, their existence a quiet act of defiance. But for most, the days after torture were only a slow descent toward death. Hunger and disease, already merciless, claimed weakened bodies quickly, leaving only bones behind on the dungeon floor. In the medieval dungeon, torture was not an event but a cycle. Capture, break, return, and rot. Broken bodies haunted every corner, reminders that survival did not mean freedom. It only meant living a little longer in agony, waiting for the day when the dungeon would claim what little strength remained. By the time a prisoner had endured hunger, disease, and the cruel hands of torture, one truth became painfully clear. The dungeon itself was a trap designed not for survival, but for certain death. Its walls did not simply hold men, they consumed them. Few who entered ever walked free again. For most, the dungeon was not a temporary punishment, but a slow grave, each day pulling them closer to their final breath. From the moment the iron door clanged shut, the dungeon began its work. The absence of sunlight stripped away the body's strength, draining hope from the mind. The heavy foul air poisoned the lungs. Food and water were given only in amounts that prolonged suffering, never enough to nourish. Shackles gnawed into wrists and ankles until they bled, leaving wounds that festered in filth. Even without whips or racks, the dungeon itself was a torturer, its silence, its darkness, its endless cold. For the poor prisoners, death was certain and swift. Starvation shrank them to skeletons, their bodies collapsing on damp stone floors. They coughed until their lungs filled with blood, their fevers burning until delirium carried them away. Rats picked at their corpses before guards ever bothered to remove them. For the wealthy, bribery only bought time. A softer bed or fresher bread delayed the inevitable, but when gold ran out, privilege vanished. In the dungeon's balance, all men eventually became equal in death. The guards knew this truth well. They did not see prisoners as people to be reformed or freed, but as bodies to be used, broken, and discarded. Their cruelty was sharpened by the knowledge that the dungeon itself would finish the work for them. If a man did not die from hunger, disease would take him. If disease failed, torture would. If torture left him alive, madness or despair would claim what remained. Even those rare few who clung stubbornly to life found themselves trapped in an unending cycle. Days blurred into nights with no way to mark time. Hope withered when prisoners realized no one outside remembered them. Families could not reach past stone walls, and kings or lords seldom pardoned those cast into the abyss. Each cough, each shuffle of chains, each cry in the darkness was a reminder that freedom was a dream, not a possibility. The dungeon became a tomb long before it held only the dead. The walls absorbed suffering, echoing with screams that never faded. Every corner reeked of rot. Every corridor carried the weight of despair. Those who survived longer did so not because they were stronger, but because death chose to pass them by a little while longer, only to return later with greater cruelty. The cruelest truth was that prisoners often prayed for death. Starving men begged to be struck down quickly. The tortured begged for a final blow. The diseased begged for release from fever and pain. Yet the dungeon rarely granted swift mercy. Instead, it prolonged the agony, stretching out suffering until death was not only certain but unbearable to await. No one who entered left unchanged. Those few who were released, wealthy enough, connected enough, or spared by chance, carried broken minds and scarred bodies for the rest of their lives. Many never fully escaped the dungeon, for its darkness followed them into the light, haunting their dreams, stealing their peace. For the rest, the dungeon was not a place of justice, but a death sentence written in stone and shadow. It was not iron bars alone that held them, it was despair itself. In this way, the medieval dungeon was not simply a prison, it was a trap of certain death, a place where hope was extinguished, and every path led only to the grave.